It is 6:55 in the morning on December 7, 1941, and on the island of Rahu, the United States Pacific Fleet is asleep. Sailors are still in their bunks. Church bells will ring in a few hours. Newspapers sitting on porches talk about football scores and Christmas shopping lists. Nobody on that island believes that within the hour, their nation will be dragged into the deadliest war in human history. Nobody believes that within 90 minutes, more than 2,000 Americans will be dead, a dozen warships will be sunk or burning in the harbor, and the entire balance of global power will shift forever. Nobody believes that the ordinary Sunday morning they are living through will become one of the most studied, most remembered, most consequential mornings of the entire 20th century. This is the story of how a single, meticulously planned air raid changed the course of history. This is the story of how a nation that wanted nothing to do with war was forced, in the span of 1 hour and 15 minutes, to become the arsenal of democracy and the deciding power of the modern world. This is the story of Pearl Harbor, told from the beginning in full, so that by the end you understand not just what happened, but why it happened, how it happened, and what it changed forever. To understand why hundreds of Japanese aircraft appeared over Hawaii on that December morning, we have to go back more than a decade earlier, into the 1930s, into a very different world, one already sliding toward catastrophe. Japan in the early 20th century was a nation transformed. Just decades earlier, it had been a feudal, isolated island empire. By the 1930s, it had rapidly industrialized, built a modern navy that rivaled the great powers of Europe, and developed imperial ambitions to match. But Japan had one enormous, glaring weakness. It was an island nation almost entirely lacking in natural resources. No significant oil reserves, limited iron, limited rubber. Everything the modern industrial and military machine required, Japan had to import. And as its military leadership grew more aggressive and expansionist through the 1930s, that dependency became a ticking clock. In 1931, the Japanese military invaded Manchuria in northern China, installing a puppet state and signaling to the world that Tokyo intended to build an empire by force. The League of Nations condemned the invasion. Japan simply withdrew from the League and continued. By 1937, full-scale war had erupted between Japan and China, a brutal, grinding conflict marked by staggering brutality, including the horrific events in Nanking, where Japanese forces committed mass atrocities against Chinese civilians that shocked the world and hardened American public opinion against Tokyo. The United States, while not yet a combatant, was watching closely and increasingly with alarm. Washington's response was not military, it was economic. Beginning in the late 1930s and accelerating through 1940 and 1941, the United States began tightening restrictions on trade with Japan. Scrap metal exports were curtailed. Aviation fuel sales were restricted. And then, in the summer of 1941, after Japan moved troops into southern French Indochina, President Roosevelt authorized one of the most consequential economic decisions of the pre-war era: the freezing of Japanese assets in the United States, followed by an almost total embargo on oil exports to Japan. Britain and the Dutch East Indies government, in exile after the fall of the Netherlands to Germany, followed suit. For a nation that imported roughly 80 to 90% of its oil and drew a substantial share of that from American suppliers, this was not merely inconvenient, it was existential. Japan's navy, at current consumption rates, had perhaps a year to 18 months of oil reserves left. Without oil, ships could not sail, planes could not fly, and the entire imperial project would grind to a halt. Japanese military planners studied their options and arrived at a stark conclusion. There was really only one region in Asia rich enough in oil, rubber, and other resources to make Japan self-sufficient: Southeast Asia, particularly the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. But seizing those resources meant war, almost certainly with Britain and the Netherlands, and quite possibly with the United States, whose colonial possession in the Philippines sat directly across the sea lanes any Japanese conquest would require, and that presented a terrifying strategic problem. If Japan moved south to seize those resources, the American Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor, sat on Japan's flank like a loaded gun, capable of cutting off the entire operation and threatening the home islands themselves. Through the autumn of 1941, diplomats in Washington and Tokyo engaged in increasingly desperate, increasingly hopeless negotiations. American Secretary of State Cordell Hull demanded that Japan withdraw entirely from China and Indochina as a precondition for lifting the oil embargo. To the civilian government in Tokyo, and even to many moderates within the military, this was viewed as an impossible demand, a demand that Japan simply abandon years of conquest and the enormous investment of blood and treasure it represented. Japan's government was fractured between moderates, including at times Emperor Hirohito himself, who feared that war with the industrial giant of the United States could not possibly be won, and hardline militarists, increasingly dominant in Tokyo, who argued that time was not on Japan's side, that the oil clock was running out, and that Japan's only realistic path to victory was a swift, overwhelming first strike that would cripple American naval power in the Pacific before the United States could fully mobilize its vastly larger industrial base. That argument found its most capable, and in many ways its most reluctant, advocate in one of the most fascinating figures of the entire Pacific War, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto was, in many respects, an unlikely architect of war with America. As a young officer, he had studied at Harvard University. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington in the 1920s. He had traveled extensively across the United States, touring its oil fields in Texas, its automobile factories in Detroit, witnessing firsthand the staggering scale of American industry. He understood, in a way that few men in the Japanese high command truly did, that the United States possessed an industrial capacity that Japan could never hope to match in a prolonged war. Yamamoto reportedly told friends and colleagues privately that a long war against America would be catastrophic for Japan, and he opposed the drift toward war with the United States for months. But once it became clear that Tokyo's political and military leadership had committed to war regardless of his personal misgivings, Yamamoto made a fateful decision. If war was truly unavoidable, then Japan's only chance, however slim, was not a slow build-up or a defensive posture, but a single, devastating, opening blow so severe it would buy Japan 6 months to a year of unchallenged dominance in the Pacific, time enough, he hoped, to seize the resources it needed and force a negotiated peace before American industrial might could be brought fully to bear. The target of that opening blow would be the United States Pacific Fleet, at anchor in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The plan itself, when Yamamoto first proposed it to Japan's Naval General Staff in early 1941, was considered by many senior officers to be reckless, bordering on suicidal. It called for a carrier strike force to cross more than 3,000 miles of open, frequently storm-tossed North Pacific Ocean, maintaining absolute radio silence for nearly 2 weeks, avoiding all commercial shipping lanes, remaining completely undetected by American reconnaissance aircraft and naval patrols, and then launching a full-scale aerial assault against the most heavily defended American naval base in the Pacific. No nation in history had ever attempted a carrier strike of this scale, at this distance, in total secrecy. If the fleet was spotted even once during its 2-week transit, the entire element of surprise, upon which the whole plan depended, would be lost, and the strike force itself could be destroyed by American counterattack before it ever launched a single plane. Yamamoto pressed forward regardless, and through the summer and autumn of 1941, Japanese naval aviators trained intensively for the mission, practicing dive bombing and, crucially, developing specially modified aerial torpedoes fitted with wooden fins that would allow them to run properly in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, a technical problem that had initially seemed insurmountable, since standard aerial torpedoes of the era would simply bury themselves in the harbor's shallow mud on impact. Japanese intelligence officers, meanwhile, had for months been gathering detailed information on Pearl Harbor through espionage, most notably through a Japanese consular official on Oahu who regularly reported on the exact positions of American warships in the harbor, feeding Tokyo a remarkably precise picture of exactly where every battleship, cruiser, and carrier would likely be moored on any given day. The strike force itself, designated the Kaido Butai, or Mobile Force, was built around 6 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shikaku, and Zuikaku, together carrying over 400 combat aircraft, an extraordinary concentration of naval air power unmatched anywhere in the world at that time. Escorting the carriers were 2 battleships, several heavy cruisers, a screen of destroyers, and an advance force of submarines, including 5 midget submarines intended to slip into the harbor itself and attack from within. Command of the strike force fell to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a respected but by some accounts cautious officer whose temperament would prove consequential in the attack's aftermath. On November 26, 1941, the Kaido Butai departed from Hitakapu Bay in the remote, fog-shrouded Kuril Islands, chosen specifically for its isolation and its distance from prying eyes. For the next 12 days, the fleet steamed eastward across the empty northern Pacific, deliberately routed through waters rarely traveled by commercial or military shipping, maintaining total radio silence so complete that even routine communications between ships were conducted by signal flag and blinker light rather than radio transmission, to deny American listening posts any trace of the fleet's movement. The northern route brought its own dangers: rough seas, freezing temperatures, and the constant risk of discovery by chance encounter with a merchant vessel or fishing boat. Remarkably, none came. The fleet refueled at sea, a difficult and dangerous operation in heavy swells, and pressed on, undetected, toward Hawaii. Back in Washington and in Hawaii itself, American commanders were not blind to the possibility of war. Tensions with Japan had been rising for months, and on November 27, 1941, the War Department sent what became known as a war warning to commanders across the Pacific, including Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Walter Short, commander of Army forces in Hawaii. But that warning, based on the best intelligence available at the time, emphasized the likelihood of Japanese aggression in Southeast Asia against British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, or the Philippines, not a direct attack on Hawaii itself, 7,000 miles from Tokyo. American military intelligence, while aware Japan might soon go to war, simply did not believe Pearl Harbor itself was a plausible target. It was considered too distant, too well defended, too obvious a target for a strike Japan could not hope to survive if American forces were alert and ready. As a direct result of that misjudgment, and in response to specific concerns about potential sabotage by Japanese sympathizers on the islands, General Short ordered American aircraft on Oahu's airfields parked close together, wingtip to wingtip, in the open, reasoning that tightly clustered planes would be easier for a limited number of guards to protect against ground-based sabotage. It was, in hindsight, a catastrophic decision, because it meant that when the real threat arrived from the air rather than from saboteurs on the ground, those same tightly parked aircraft became devastatingly easy targets, entire rows of American planes destroyed by single bombing runs. Similarly, anti-aircraft ammunition aboard many ships and at coastal defense batteries was kept in locked storage rather than distributed to gun crews, again a precaution against a threat that never materialized, one that would cost precious minutes when the actual attack began. There was, however, one significant piece of good fortune for the United States that morning, one that would prove enormously consequential in the months to come. None of the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were in port at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The USS Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The USS Lexington was en route to Midway on a similar mission. The USS Saratoga was undergoing repairs on the West Coast. Had those carriers been moored in the harbor that morning, alongside the battleships, the entire course of the subsequent Pacific War might have unfolded very differently, because it would be those very carriers, spared by chance, that carried the American war effort through its darkest early months and ultimately delivered the decisive blow at Midway. What was in port, moored in pairs along the eastern side of Ford Island in a formation that came to be known as Battleship Row, were 8 of the fleet's mighty battleships: the USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Nevada, USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, and USS Pennsylvania, the last of these in dry dock rather than moored in the row itself. Alongside them sat cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, over 90 ships in total at anchor in and around the harbor that Sunday morning. The pride of the United States Navy gathered together in one place, utterly unprepared for what was coming. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, roughly 230 miles due north of Rahu, the carriers of the Kaido Butai turned into the wind and began launching the first wave of the attack. It was still dark. Deck crews worked by dim red battle lighting. One by one, aircraft roared down the flight decks and lifted into the pre-dawn sky. Dive bombers, high-level bombers, torpedo bombers armed with their specially modified shallow-water torpedoes, and Zero fighters to sweep the skies clear of any American resistance. In total, 2 waves comprising 353 aircraft would strike Pearl Harbor and the surrounding airfields that morning. Leading the first wave was Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, an experienced naval aviator who would become, for better or worse, one of the most recognizable names associated with the attack. As Fuchida's formation approached Oahu from the north and confirmed that the American fleet remained utterly unaware of their approach, he radioed back to the fleet, the coded signal confirming total surprise had been achieved, a phrase that has echoed through history books and films ever since. Tora, 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 meaning tiger, tiger, tiger. There had in fact been warning signs that morning tragically missed or dismissed in the final hours before the attack. Shortly after 7 in the morning, an Army radar station at Opana Point on the northern tip of Rahu, operated by 2 young privates conducting a training exercise, picked up an enormous formation of aircraft on their primitive radar screen, a blip larger than anything they had ever recorded. They dutifully reported the contact to the Army's information center, but the lieutenant on duty there, aware that a flight of American B-17 bombers was expected to arrive from the mainland that same morning, assumed the radar contact was simply that incoming flight and told the radar operators not to worry about it. It was an understandable, even reasonable assumption in the moment, and it would prove one of the most consequential misjudgments of the entire war. Even earlier that morning, at around 6:40 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward had spotted and engaged a Japanese midget submarine attempting to slip into the harbor's restricted waters, firing what were, in effect, the first American shots of the Pacific War, more than an hour before the air attack even began. The Ward's report worked its way up the chain of command, but confusion, disbelief, and the sheer unprecedented nature of the report meant that no general alarm was sounded across the base before the aircraft appeared overhead. At 7:55 a.m., the first Japanese bombs began falling on Pearl Harbor and on the airfields surrounding it. Within moments, the peaceful Sunday morning shattered into complete chaos. Torpedo bombers swept in low and fast over the water of the harbor, their pilots skimming mere feet above the surface before releasing their specially modified torpedoes, which sliced through the water and slammed into the hulls of the battleships moored along Battleship Row. Simultaneously, dive bombers screamed down out of the sky to strike the airfields at Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Kaneohe Naval Air Station, and Ua Field, where American aircraft, parked wingtip to wingtip exactly as ordered against the threat of sabotage, burned and exploded in long, devastating rows before most of them ever had a chance to take off. At Ford Island itself, and aboard ships throughout the harbor, sailors ran to battle stations in whatever they had been wearing moments before, many still in pajamas or undershirts, scrambling through smoke and flying shrapnel toward gun mounts and damage control stations. Anti-aircraft crews fought desperately to break open locked ammunition lockers, and in the chaos of those first minutes, some sailors fired back at attacking aircraft with nothing more than rifles, and in at least a few documented cases, sidearms, an act more of defiance than of any real hope of shooting down a diving aircraft. The USS Arizona suffered the single worst blow of the entire attack, one that came to symbolize the tragedy of the day more than any other single event. At approximately 8:06 in the morning, a Japanese armor-piercing bomb, converted from a large naval artillery shell, plunged through the battleship's forward deck and detonated deep within her hull, very close to or within a forward ammunition magazine. The resulting explosion was catastrophic beyond anything else witnessed that day, a massive fireball and shockwave that tore the ship's bow apart and sent a column of smoke and debris hundreds of feet into the sky. The Arizona sank in a matter of minutes, still moored to her berth, taking with her more than 1,100 of her crew, nearly half of all American lives lost during the entire attack in a single, almost instantaneous catastrophe. To this day, the Arizona remains where she sank, at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, and remarkably, oil from her ruptured fuel bunkers still rises slowly to the surface even now, more than 8 decades later, drops sometimes called by visitors the Tears of the Arizona, or Black Tears, a haunting and literal reminder that has never fully faded. The USS Oklahoma suffered a similarly devastating fate, though her story unfolded with a different, agonizing kind of horror. Struck by multiple torpedoes in rapid succession along her port side, the Oklahoma began to capsize within minutes, rolling almost completely over in the harbor's shallow water. For the sailors trapped inside as she rolled, the world became instantly and totally dark, disorienting, and terrifying. Compartments flooding, air pockets shrinking, men trapped in compartments now upside down relative to how they had learned the ship's layout. In the hours and days that followed, rescue crews worked with heroic urgency, cutting through the exposed hull plating with cutting torches, following the sound of men banging on the steel from within to locate survivors. 32 men were pulled alive from the capsized hull in the days after the attack, extraordinary rescues carried out under grueling, dangerous conditions, though tragically, more than 400 of the Oklahoma's crew did not survive. The USS West Virginia and USS California were both struck by multiple torpedoes and settled slowly into the harbor's mud rather than capsizing outright, their crews fighting fires and flooding for hours in a desperate effort at damage control that, in the case of both ships, ultimately allowed them to be salvaged, repaired, and returned to service later in the war, a testament to the skill and courage of their crews even in the face of overwhelming attack. The USS Nevada, moored slightly apart from the other battleships, achieved something no other battleship managed that morning, getting underway during the attack itself. Her captain absent ashore that morning, it was her senior surviving officers and crew who made the extraordinary decision to attempt to sortie out of the harbor even as Japanese aircraft continued their assault, an act of tremendous courage that also drew intense enemy attention, since a fleeing battleship attempting to reach open water represented, in the eyes of Japanese pilots, an extremely valuable target. Struck by additional bombs as she attempted her escape, the Nevada's crew ultimately made the difficult but wise decision to beach her deliberately near Hospital Point rather than risk her sinking in the main channel, where a wreck could have blocked the harbor entirely for the ships that would need to use it in the difficult months ahead. In the skies above this chaos, a small number of American fighter pilots managed the extraordinary feat of getting airborne at all amid the confusion and destruction on the ground. Second Lieutenants George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, roused from a night of poker and little sleep at a nearby bachelor officers' quarters, sprinted to their cars, raced to an auxiliary airfield at Haliwa, where their P-40 fighters happened to be dispersed away from the main bases, and managed to get airborne in the midst of the attack. Over the following hour, flying with tremendous aggression against overwhelming numbers, the 2 young pilots were each credited with shooting down several Japanese aircraft, becoming among the very few genuine bright spots of organized aerial resistance on a morning otherwise defined by shock, surprise, and desperate improvisation. By the time the second wave of Japanese aircraft completed its bombing runs and turned back toward the waiting carriers at around 9:45 in the morning, the attack, from first bomb to last, had lasted less than 2 hours. In that brief span of time, the damage inflicted was staggering. 18 American ships had been sunk or seriously damaged, including all 8 battleships that had been moored in the harbor that morning. Nearly 200 American aircraft had been destroyed, the overwhelming majority of them caught helplessly on the ground. 2,403 Americans were dead, and well over 1,100 more had been wounded, casualty figures that, for a single morning's action, remain among the highest suffered by American forces in the nation's history outside of the deadliest single days of the Civil War. Japan's own losses, by comparison, were remarkably, almost shockingly light, fewer than 30 aircraft lost, along with all 5 of the midget submarines that had attempted to penetrate the harbor, and fewer than 100 Japanese personnel killed in the entire operation. And yet, in the midst of what appeared to be a total and overwhelming Japanese victory, Admiral Nagumo made a decision aboard the Akagi that historians have debated and second-guessed for more than 80 years since. Several of his subordinate commanders, most notably Commander Minoru Genda, urged him to launch a third wave of attacks, this time targeting not the already devastated battleships, but Pearl Harbor's massive above-ground fuel storage tanks, its ship repair facilities, and its submarine base, infrastructure that, if destroyed, could have crippled American naval operations in the Pacific for a year or more, potentially forcing the entire Pacific Fleet to withdraw all the way back to bases on the American West Coast. Nagumo, however, weighed the risks carefully and chose caution instead. He did not know the location of the American aircraft carriers that had not been in port that morning, and he feared that a continued presence near Hawaii risked exposing his own irreplaceable carrier force to a devastating counterattack from those very carriers, or from land-based bombers still capable of striking back. With his pilots already fatigued, his fuel reserves a growing concern for the long return voyage, and the element of surprise now entirely spent, Nagumo ordered the fleet to withdraw and turn for home. It was a decision that, in hindsight, may well have cost Japan the war before the war had truly even begun. The fuel tanks left standing at Pearl Harbor held nearly the entire operational fuel reserve for the Pacific Fleet at that stage of the war. The repair yards left intact allowed heavily damaged ships, including the West Virginia, California, Nevada, and others, to be salvaged, repaired, and returned to active service, several of them fighting again by the war's end, and the aircraft carriers spared by simple chance that morning would, within 6 months, deliver Japan a defeat at the Battle of Midway from which its navy never fully recovered. News of the attack reached Washington within hours of its conclusion, arriving first in fragmentary, often garbled reports before the full scale of the disaster became clear over the following day. The American public's reaction, once official word broke into regular radio programming that Sunday afternoon, moved almost instantly from stunned disbelief to unified, resolute fury. Families across the country gathered around their living room radios as normal broadcasts were interrupted again and again with fresh bulletins. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt informed of the scale of the disaster that same afternoon. Spent that night and the following morning drafting what would become one of the most famous and consequential speeches in American history. On December 8, 1941, Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress, and through radio, a nation listening in nearly every home across the country, describing December 7th as, in his now immortal words, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan that same day with only a single dissenting vote, cast by Representative Jeannette Rankin of Montana, a committed pacifist who had also voted against American entry into the First World War. 3 days later, on December 11th, Japan's allies Germany and Italy, honoring their treaty obligations under the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States in turn, and America, a nation that had spent more than 2 years insisting, through both public sentiment and official neutrality legislation, that it would remain out of the wars consuming Europe and Asia, found itself thrust fully and irrevocably into a genuinely global two-ocean conflict. The human cost and the human drama of Pearl Harbor did not conclude when the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon that Sunday morning. In the days and weeks that followed, rescue and salvage crews worked around the clock in the harbor, in grim and dangerous conditions, some men risking their own lives cutting into the exposed, oil-slicked hulls of capsized ships in a desperate race against time to reach trapped and dying sailors before oxygen ran out or rising water sealed their fate. The bodies of the fallen were recovered wherever recovery was possible in the difficult weeks that followed, though a great many, particularly those still entombed within the sunken hull of the Arizona, were never recovered at all, a decision ultimately made, deliberately and with great solemnity, to leave the ship and her fallen crew resting together at the bottom of the harbor, so that the wreck itself could serve as their permanent, undisturbed memorial and final resting place. In the wider country, the shock of Pearl Harbor triggered an extraordinary wave of patriotism and volunteerism, young men lining up at recruiting stations in numbers that overwhelmed the capacity of local offices to process them. But it also triggered, tragically and shamefully, a wave of fear-driven prejudice directed at Japanese Americans, the overwhelming majority of whom were loyal American citizens with no connection whatsoever to the attack or to the government of Japan. Within months, that fear translated into official government policy when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942, authorizing the forced relocation and internment of more than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the west coast of the United States, roughly two-thirds of them native-born American citizens, into remote internment camps for the duration of the war. It stands today as one of the darkest and most widely condemned civil liberties violations in modern American history, a decision driven overwhelmingly by wartime hysteria and prejudice rather than any genuine evidence of disloyalty, and one for which the United States government formally apologized and paid reparations decades later in 1988. Strategically, viewed across the full arc of the war that followed, Pearl Harbor delivered to Japan almost everything Yamamoto had hoped for in the immediate short term, and almost nothing he privately feared would follow in the long term. The attack devastated the American battleship fleet in a single stroke and dealt a shattering blow to American military pride and immediate operational readiness in the Pacific. But it failed, critically, to destroy the aircraft carriers that would prove utterly decisive in the years of war to come. It failed to destroy the enormous fuel reserves and repair infrastructure that allowed the Pacific Fleet to rebuild, and in some cases literally raise sunken ships from the harbor floor with startling speed. And most consequentially of all, it failed entirely to break American will, achieving instead the precise opposite of its intended effect, unifying an until then deeply divided nation almost overnight, and unleashing the full, staggering capacity of American industry into total war production. Within less than 4 years, that industrial base would outproduce every other combatant nation on Earth combined, building aircraft carriers, warships, tanks, and aircraft at a scale and speed that made Japan's ultimate defeat, in the clear light of hindsight, very nearly inevitable from the moment the American economy fully mobilized. Yamamoto himself is widely reported to have privately warned his superiors, even before the attack was launched, that Japan might run wild and achieve victory after victory for perhaps 6 months to a year, but that he held no confidence whatsoever in Japan's ability to win a war that extended significantly beyond that window, a grimly prophetic assessment from the very architect of the attack itself. 6 months almost to the day after Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway, fought largely by the very carriers spared that December morning, shattered the offensive power of the Japanese carrier fleet for good, and the long, grinding path toward Allied victory in the Pacific had truly begun. Today, the wreck of the USS Arizona remains exactly where she sank on the morning of December 7, 1941, resting on the floor of Pearl Harbor, and above her now stands the USS Arizona Memorial, a striking white structure that seems, deliberately, to float weightlessly above the sunken hull without ever touching it, a design intended to evoke both strength and sorrow, visited by more than 1 million people from around the world every single year. Visitors looking down through the clear harbor water can still make out the shape of the sunken battleship beneath them, and can still, remarkably, watch drops of oil rising slowly to the surface even now, more than 8 decades after she went down, a quiet, haunting, and entirely real reminder of that morning that refuses to fully fade with time. Pearl Harbor is remembered today not only as one of the greatest military intelligence failures and combat disasters in American history, but also, and perhaps ultimately more importantly, as the precise moment that the American 20th century truly began in earnest, the moment the United States stopped being a comparatively isolated bystander to world events and stepped fully onto the stage as the dominant global military, economic, and political power for the remainder of the century that followed. Every December 7th, survivors, the families of the fallen, active duty service members, and the nation as a whole pause to remember, at ceremonies held at Pearl Harbor itself and at memorials across the country. Fewer and fewer of the men who actually lived through that terrible, chaotic, courageous morning remain with us today, their numbers dwindling with each passing year, but their story, thoroughly documented, endlessly studied, and passed down now through multiple generations, endures. It endures as a story of catastrophic failure and extraordinary individual courage occurring within the very same hour, side by side, indistinguishable from one another in the smoke and chaos of that morning. It endures as a story of a nation caught utterly and tragically unprepared, and of what that very same nation, wounded and furious, went on to become in the years that followed. Pearl Harbor teaches us, even now, how quickly the entire world can change in the span of a single morning, how catastrophically dangerous it can be to underestimate an enemy's capability or its will, and how a moment of devastating, humiliating defeat can, against all odds, become the very spark that forges a nation's unbreakable determination. So here, at the end of this story, is the question I want to leave you with today. If you had been a young sailor aboard one of those battleships moored along Battleship Row that Sunday morning, waking to the sound of explosions and watching the sky suddenly fill with enemy aircraft with almost no warning at all, what do you think you would have done in those first, chaotic, terrifying seconds? Would you have run for a weapon, run for your station, or simply run for your life? Let me know your thoughts, honestly, down in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you today, if you learned something new about one of the single most consequential mornings in modern history, do me one simple favor. Hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about real, accurate military history. Subscribe if you are not already, because we bring you deep, thoroughly researched dives like this one into naval history, air power, and the greatest and most consequential battles that shaped the modern world every single week. And if you know someone, a friend, a family member, a fellow history lover who needs to hear this story told properly and in full, share this video with them. Thank you truly for spending this time with me today. I will see you in the next one.